I'm Jonathan Paquin, the directeur du Centre sur la sécurité internationale. We are happy to have Stephen Saideman with us today. Professor Saideman is a political scientist at the Norman Paterson School of International Relations. He's the Paterson Chair in International Relations Affairs. He's going to talk about his new book, Adapting in the Dust. I forgot the last part of the title.
Lessons learned by Canada.
Exactly. It's at U of T Press. I know that Steve did several interviews with people in Afghanistan, but also with people at DND here, and he has certainly a lot to talk about Afghanistan today. Thank you, Steve, for being here. You have 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and then 30 minutes for the Q&A.
Okay.
Great.
Yes.
Thanks for being here.
Sure. Thank you for having me here today. I'd like to do this talk in French, but you can take the boy out of the gill, but you can't take the gill out of the boy. I did, over the course of time, have enough briefings in Montreal that I started to understand the briefings in French. I couldn't repeat them, but I could start asking questions about, wow, that kind of strange. You have now 2 American battalions rather than 1. This is obviously confusing to you because it turns out that each American battalion behaves differently, unlike the Canadians, where the Vendus operates exactly the same way as every other Canadian unit. The idea of this book came about by accident, which is I was writing a book on NATO and Afghanistan, and Canada turned out to be one half of one chapter of that book, but I had such great access here in Canada, as well as learning a fair amount downrange about Canada, because I was an opinion leader, which meant I was a random academic that they brought to Kandahar and Kabul in 2007, where they were trying to get us academics to talk very favorably at the mission as part of their information operations directed at the Canadian public, which was probably a mistake because we are not reliable messengers. But I learned a lot from that experience. I learned a lot from being first in Montreal and then in Ottawa, talking to members of the military, talking to people in the government. And so what became sort of a part of a larger book became an entirely different book. And it's not really an academic book, it's aimed more at the Canadian public because the basic premise of the book is that we learn most about people when they're placed under a great deal of pressure. That pressure reveals character. And the challenge about Afghanistan is it was the hardest thing that Canada's done in the world since Korea, maybe. Certainly the bloodiest war that Canada's engaged in since Korea. It involved tens of billions of dollars. It involved the focus of the parliament and of the prime minister and of the entire bureaucracy. When we hear the phrase whole of government, these days, Prime Minister Trudeau used that phrase yesterday to talk about the next mission, which is not really a whole of government mission, but he's using that phrase. The images that come up are about Afghanistan, because in Afghanistan you had this whole of government. Everybody in the government was very much focused on this, to almost the exclusion of anything else. So the next step, once you do one of these things, is try to understand the character of the Canadian government, which is what I'm trying to do. But also I'm trying to do something the government couldn't do, which is the government, after the mission was over with, did something the military always does, which is the military always does a lessons learned exercise after everything. After any exercise, they go back and say, what did we learn? It's almost as if they, after breakfast, they'll figure out what did we learn from breakfast. But the military did this after Afghanistan, but the civilians never do this. But they did this one time. And if I had the slides up here, I'd show where it is now, which is in the same room as at the last scene of the Raiders of the Lost Ark, where there's this big warehouse, lots of boxes, never to be seen again. That's where the report is. It's not just that I can't access the report. I tried, I got denied. But it's that nobody in government has access to this report. And so if nobody in government can learn the lessons of Afghanistan, chances are we'll make the same mistakes all over again. So my book is an effort to do that as well. And the first part of the book is basically aimed at trying to address some of the myths that have developed about Afghanistan. And there's sort of 3 that are central. One is that Canada was alone in Kandahar, that we had no help, that we're out there on the frontier fighting by ourselves, and that nothing else is going on. And this is simply not true. Canada was never alone in Kandahar. It was never alone in Afghanistan. Other countries were present. Now, maybe not as many countries were as present as we would like. Merci beaucoup. Now, if you're so shaped, this could be a problem. But anyway, so there's a picture of documents. Anyway, we were not alone in Kandahar. That one of the reasons why we ended up in Kandahar in the first place was that was the major air base in southern Afghanistan. And so that's where the Americans were going to be, that's where the British were going to be, that's where everybody else was going to be, providing a variety of resources that the Canadians could depend upon, including planes, helicopters, satellite communications, and on and on and on and on. And so even in the big battle of Operation Medusa, which was in 2006, where there were a lot of complaints about how certain allies didn't show up, we'll call them the Germans. Others didn't show up as well, but we were hoping the Germans would show up. The Americans were there, the Brits were there, the Dutch couldn't really be at the front, but they were willing to guard our base so that way we could be there. The Danes were there. So there were a lot of allies who were there. So even in that big battle, we were not alone. The second myth is that Canada, we like to think of Canada as being very special, and Canada is very special. Canada was extraordinary in this mission, but it was not unique. That a lot of the problems that Canada had, other countries had. Almost every problem that Canada had, or every challenge that Canada had, and almost everything that Canada did, other countries would do it. Maybe not all of them, but many of them. And so, for instance, every country that was operating in Afghanistan was doing something that was hard, which was picking up Afghans who they wanted to detain because they were suspected insurgents or they'd been captured in the battlefield. And it wasn't a traditional war where you just put prisoners of war in a prisoner of war camp and that's the end of it. You know, we were in some country that was supposed to be sovereign. And our traditional solution for handling detainees was to hand them over to the Americans, because the Americans were big enough to always build their own prisons. After Guantanamo, after Abu Ghraib, this was not permissible for Canada, and was not politically possible for the British, the French, the Dutch, the Danes, on and on and on. Every country had this problem. Every country developed a bilateral deal with the Afghans. The bilateral deals varied. Every country was dissatisfied with bilateral deals because Afghanistan ultimately was a country that had different norms for how to treat prisoners and was reluctant or unable to really reform itself in ways that made it compatible with the way Western democracies deal with their prisoners. And so this was a continual problem for all of us, not just Canada. We had a couple of extension votes that were controversial, that Harper, almost immediately when he became in office, extended the mission from what had been a 1 or 2 year mission to something that was going to last until 2009. And then in 2008, there was a big, long-out drama about the 2008 vote that would extend the mission from 2009 to 2011. Again, not unique. Other countries had politics about how to extend the mission. Ultimately, the Dutch left earlier than Canada. That meant earlier than anybody else, because they had a vote in 2010 that ultimately led to a no confidence vote, which led to the government collapsing. And so they had pulled out their troops in 2010. Like the Dutch, the Canadians left, and we both returned. The Dutch returned with a police mission, we returned with a training mission. So some people might refer to Afghanistan as the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. As Obama has found out to his misery, because Obama would have liked to have checked out of Afghanistan in 2014, but the Americans may be reinforcing and getting larger. So these are things that are not just unique to Canada. The third thing, and it's probably the worst myth of all, because it has the most impact on the future of Canada and the future of Canadian civil-military relations, which is there's a myth about why we got into Kandahar in the first place. The myth is that the Canadian military was essentially in bed with the American military and waved the magic wand and caused Paul Martin to decide to send the troops to Kandahar. This is incredibly destructive to Canadian civil relations because it suggests that the military has its own agenda and can fool the politicians into doing things that are potentially very, very dangerous. Janice Stein, who is one of the most visible and famous international relations scholars, along with Eugene Lang, who had been an advisor to multiple liberal defense ministers, wrote this book that has helped to develop and legitimize this mythology. But there's a real problem with it, which was the military was not the only ones advocating Kandahar. It was also being advocated by members of Foreign Affairs, or what is now known as GAC. It was advocated by the ambassador at the time, Chris Alexander, who was seen as a future guiding light for some party, not so much anymore. And it was advocated by the senior representatives, because at the time they were noticing there's not a whole lot of development in Kandahar. We can make a big difference in Kandahar. In the aftermath, they're like, well, now we know why there's not a whole lot of development going on in Kandahar. But it was a whole government effort to assess this mission, where most of the relevant players thought this made sense. For the military, it made sense because Kandahar was a central location, so they'd have a lot of resources, so that they could make a visible contribution. They wanted to be visible about making a contribution. The British were trying to figure out, the British wanted Kandahar, which might have meant that we got stuck with Helmand, and Helmand turned out to be the worst place in Afghanistan, because that's where poppies grow, so that's where the violence was most extreme. The choice for Canada at the time was really between Kandahar and Herat. Herat was in the western part of Afghanistan. We thought it might be dangerous because it was close to Iran. But one of the things the military didn't say out loud, but I think one of the factors that was involved with, if we were in Herat, we'd be relying on the Italians, because they were the major contributor in that part of the country. They were the ones leading that sector. And that would have been very problematic. The Italians had a total of 6 helicopters for the entire sector, which would have meant, if you need help, if you need medical evacuation, would they be there for you? Well, given the rules of engagement the Italians had, which were pretty restrictive, they didn't engage in offensive operations, for instance. It's not clear that they would have been that compatible of an ally. Whereas in Kandahar, you'd have the British, who the Canadians are very familiar with, the Americans, who we exercise with all the time, the Dutch, who were alongside the Canadians in Bosnia, so they were known quantities. And this is very important because when you talk to the military, they use words that you expect to hear from Dr. Phil or some other relationship advisor. They talk about trust, they talk about relationships. It sounds all very soft and squishy and touchy-feely, but you want in battle the people next to you to actually be there, show up, and do their job as you expect them to do. You want to be able to rely upon them because you're putting your lives in their hands. And we didn't have that level of trust with the Italians. We didn't have that level of trust with the Americans. And in fact, if you talk to any unit that operated in Afghanistan, the one commonality they'll say is, if you ask the Americans to show up, they will show up and with whatever you need. Because the Americans just want to be successful. And they know that, the Americans knew that it was there mostly because the United States was attacked in 2001. So this mythology is very problematic. And it leads to the next part of the book, which talks about how the politicians were playing dodgeball, trying to avoid responsibility for this war. So the liberals, once they leave power, start opposing the war, which is kind of strange to oppose a war that they started. Carleton sent the forces in, Martin sent the forces in, they leave power, they're like, why are we in Afghanistan? It doesn't make much sense. But it wasn't just the liberals who dodged responsibility for the war. There's also Harper. So this figure is of numbers of times that Harper talked about Afghanistan. And this is 2006, this is 2008, and this was 2011, 2012. And you can see it drops off a cliff in 2008, 2009. The blue line is how many times he actually talked to promote the mission, to talk up the mission. In the book, we have a different chart that breaks down the categories. Some of it is event-driven, something's going on there, he's kind of compelled to do so, either a vote here, or a prison break there, or whatever. And it's very, very striking. And so, given what Harper said before he became Prime Minister, that he was supporting the mission, why did he hide from the mission? Why did he just try to avoid the mission? And I didn't have a chance to talk to Stephen Harper, I didn't have a chance to talk to the people under him, so we can only infer from people who've been around him. But the basic argument is, A, he realized we were going to lose. or at least not win, and he didn't want to be associated with that. And the more Karzai, who was running for president around here, was behaving like Karzai, president of Afghanistan, the more you can understand why somebody might think that we're not going to win, because if the locals aren't going to be supportive of the effort, what's going to happen to us? If you don't remember, in 2008, 2009, when Karzai was running for election, it almost was if his opposing candidate was the NATO mission in Afghanistan. He was much more critical of NATO and its collateral damage than he was of the Taliban. And so this is your ally in this war. That's a real problem. So it's partly that. Partly he was very frustrated because Canada was doing more than, let's say, the Germans were, and he didn't think this was right. And third, he anticipated that the Americans would, in exchange for Canadians bleeding in Kandahar, give us what we wanted out of soft lumber, or we wanted out of pipelines, or what we wanted out of other side issues. The American attitude was, we're an alliance, you're there to help NATO out, you're here to help us out, you're not here just to get stuff from us. So the Americans didn't really hand over all these trade disputes and give Harper what he wanted. So he got very frustrated very quickly. So he largely disappears. And this is effective. One way to think about this is to ask, well, what are Canadians looking for when they're looking for information about things? And so if you do a Google trend search, Google will allow you to search for trends in Google searches. And so if you plug in Harper in Afghanistan, you'll see there's a lot of searches about, and I restricted it to Canada. It was just Canadian people in Canada looking for this information. Doing these searches, lots of Canadians were asking about what's Harper's position on Afghanistan? What was Harper doing about Afghanistan in 2006, 2007, a little bit 2008 when there's an extension battle, and then drops off the cliff. Canadians stopped asking about it because Harper wasn't making an issue of it, and they followed him. They stopped thinking about Harper's opinion on Afghanistan. And to be fair to Harper, it worked. He got his majority in 2011. And partly got his majority in 2011 because Afghanistan was no longer an issue that people cared about in Canada. Because we were out of Kandahar and we were doing a training mission that was largely invisible. To be fair, it wasn't just Harper who was playing dodgeball. It was also the Parliament. That this is a graph of the percentage of question period dedicated to Afghanistan. That's the blue line. And the red line is the percentage of the question period dedicated to the detainee question. If you just looked at the Parliament, you'd think that the mission about Afghanistan was largely about detainees, that we were there to deal with detainees. Not a war, not a counterinsurgency mission, not building a self-sustaining Afghan government, not about fighting terrorism, not about all that, not about NATO. It would appear to be about this. And there are large periods of time where the Parliament almost disappeared entirely. The extension vote 2008 did a very good job of basically taking Afghanistan off of question period for a while. Phil Lagasse refers to that effort as laundry. Just as criminals like to launder their money to get, so that way it is no longer tainted by the crime, so that way they can spend it. In Afghanistan, in Canada, in Ottawa, you had politicians act in ways to try to launder responsibility so that they were no longer responsible for this war. And it worked. And as you can see, as I said, the focus of the mission seemed to be the detainee issue. And I don't want to dismiss the importance of the detainee issue because Canada was essentially being accused of committing war crimes. But, again, everybody was going through this problem. And Canada was not being suspected of beating prisoners of war. They were suspected of handing them over to the Afghans, who might then be. This was an important issue, but it was not the primary issue. Parliament could have been asking questions like, do we have enough troops? Is there a good integration between the civilian effort and the military effort? And I'll get to that in a minute. What's the difference between what NATO wants and what Canada wants? What's going on? What is the mission about? What does success look like? Is our strategy evolving with the conflict? Lots of questions that are really meaningful. They didn't ask those questions. They asked, did we do something wrong about the treatment of detainees? Now, the one bright side of the detainee issue is it did lead to some real whole of government. When we talk about whole of government, the idea is that the government should be working in unison towards pursuing a bunch of objectives. We would like to think this is the natural form of government, but we know through bureaucratic politics that each agency has their own preferences, and they pursue their own interests, and they pursue their own vision of what's best for Canada, unless something interrupts them and forces them to be on the same page. When the first part of the detainee scandal broke out, you actually did see the civilians, what was then DFATE, and D&D and the military work on a plan to try to improve the agreement that we had with Afghanistan, to work with them, to work with each other, to try to supervise the prisons so that way we could be assured that the folks we were turning over to Afghans weren't being beat. So it did provide a moment of real whole government effort. The second moment that tried to improve this was the Manley panel. In 2007, 2008, Harper, to get an extension of the mission, appointed a senior liberal to investigate, to come up with options. And so the Manley panel recommended a variety of things. We need to have a more transparent whole of government effort, and we need to set our priorities, we need to make things clear. And so this led to having not just it be about DFATE and not just about foreign affairs, not just about the military, but also CETA. CETA had been involved for a while, but this was trying to get CETA to be cooperative. It was also getting the RCMP, the Ontario Police Patrol, Sûreté Quebec, was also sending cops to help train the police officers in Afghanistan. You had corrections involved, trying to improve the conduct of the wardens. You had other elements of the Canadian government all trying to improve Afghanistan. And it led to 6 priorities and 3 signature projects. So 3 signature projects are the Dalla Dam, 50 schools, and polio vaccination. The one enduring contribution for Afghanistan is this one, because once you vaccinate kids from polio, they're not getting polio. So if you want to the question of did Canada do good things while we're there that will last forever, that's this one. Schools, buildings can collapse. Some of them weren't built that well to begin with. The government has to staff them. The government may not staff them. The dam, if it's not taken care of, problems can occur down the road. So those are the 3 signature projects. The idea was essentially to have 3 visible things that we can tell back to the Canadians were making a difference. What they had to do with winning the war, not entirely. Of the 6 priorities, half of one had to deal with the Canadian military. That was providing a safe environment for everything else to take place, and to train the Afghan military and the Afghan police. The other priorities did not involve the military. Which is kind of strange, because if you think it's a war that we're trying to win, you'd think the military would have a larger role. But if you read the quarterly reports, because one of the requirements from this was to have a quarterly report posted online that was presented to Parliament about our progress. I dare you to find references to the counterinsurgency in there. Well, actually, there's 2 reasons why I make that dare. One is the counterinsurgency, the progress in the war was being scrubbed out by DFATE because they're like, this is not one of our signature priorities. But it's also because the government, in its wisdom, took the website and archived it, put it someplace else, because that's what you want with websites, is you want to have them established and then change them and put someplace else, which are hard to find. It's still online, but it's now under Archives Canada as opposed to its original address. So it takes a lot of work. So if you've done a lot of work to put together, let's say, a book with lots of links that were useful, no longer so useful. It was fun having conversations with my copy editor about where these documents are, because I can't. The copy editor was like not working anymore. So it was supposed to be transparent, however, it became less than transparent. To be clear, this was innovative. This whole effort was very innovative. One of the striking things in my research for the NATO book was I was traveling around the world. I kept on hearing, wow, Canada's whole of government effort is great. They're doing such good work. They're so coherent. They're so organized. There's so many people doing it. And I'd be like, I live in Ottawa. I don't hear this stuff in Ottawa. because there's so much criticism of it. Because you'd hear stories about how the Canadian military would send majors and colonels to meetings that were supposed to be sort of at the general level, because that would be a good way to block decisions, because the officers would say, sorry, I don't have the authority to make these decisions. Let me go back and talk to my boss, and then we can decide, as opposed to actually having the decision makers in the room. I was told that CETA was, I forget what the word was, traitorous is too strong a word, but deceptive, because they didn't want to be told what to do. CETA has long had certain priorities. The building prisons never was one of them. In fact, they basically said, we're not going to help you with the prison thing because that's not part of our job. Prisons aren't developed. And so you had a lot of reluctance. But you did have innovations. So you had the ROC, the representative of Canada in Kandahar. They created a D-Fate position in Kandahar to be the senior civilian, to be the one to be co-equal, or at least a viable partner for the Canadian general who was running the mission in Kandahar, who could coordinate the entire civilian effort, and then coordinate that civilian effort with the military effort. For instance, after the initial effort to do development and governance in Afghanistan, the leader of that effort, Glenn Berry, got killed in 2006, January 2006. So that shut everything down. And so you needed approval to leave base to do stuff if you were a civilian. Well, for a while there, that approval came from Ottawa, which was rarely given. And so once they developed a representative Canada in Kandahar, the ROC, the ROC had that authority to say, okay, you can go out and do this. Because otherwise, the military was going to be doing all the development missions, all the government missions, because the civilians couldn't leave base. You simply can't do work if you're stuck behind the wire. Or you have to have all the civilians, all the Afghans that you're working with come onto the provincial reconstruction team's base to talk to them, because you can go out to visit them. You also had a sub-cabinet position, the deputy minister. First it was David Mulroney, then it was Greta Busmeyer, whose job it was to be the single individual who had the ability to bring the ministers together to coordinate them. And David Mulroney was a great choice because, as people put it, he was the kind of guy to bring a gun to a knife fight. He was a really sharp, bureaucratic infighter who could get people on board, as long as he had the interest and the power of the Prime Minister behind him. Once Harper started, avoiding Afghanistan, stopped thinking about Afghanistan, Mulroney's power sort of evaporated. So there were key innovations that were important that we should think about for the future. But the progress reports were a bit dodgy. They were a bit problematic because, again, they didn't really reflect what was going on with the war. And they would say things like, the last quarterly report, the very final quarterly report, talked about how successful the effort was to improve the prison situation in Afghanistan. And then, right after that report came out, this happened, which was not the first, but the second prison break. One prison, two prison breaks over the course of the mission. Each time, hundreds of prisoners escaped. The first time, they drove up a truck, which blew up the gates, and they had all these guys, motorcycles come in and get people out. Second time, 2011, they tunneled from outside. The Taliban found a compound nearby and tunneled from outside into the prison. And the problem with this is that tunneling to have prison breaks is not a new technology. Right? We have the Great Escape during World War II. We have lots of other examples from history of tunnels. And so this could have been anticipated. And even if you want to say, okay, we didn't have control of every house outside, so we can't control what's being dug, the problem is that it wasn't just 5 guys escaped that night, it was hundreds. And so, how does that happen if the prison guards are not, circulating and investigating, making sure everything's on the up and up? Either the prison guards weren't there that night, or why aren't they there, or they were there and they were complicit. Either way, bad news. Now the problem for us is that, when I talk to people about, building better prisons in Kandahar was going from, very much the bottom up. And so we focused on improving the treatment of prisoners. The problem is that the fundamental job of prisons is to keep people in the prisons. And they utterly failed at that. And this is a real problem because if we want to talk about counterinsurgency war being a war of optics, about a war about building, if not hearts and minds, building confidence in your competency and your ability to command the battle space, having this happen twice under our noses, real problematic. And so you have a progress report saying, prison is great, then you have this happen. Overall, the biggest problem with the civilian effort was, it was a checklist that the government had come up with as saying, here's some things we can do, and we can measure progress over the course of time on this list. But what did these things have to do with winning the war? And this was a real tension point between the military, who kept on adapting, both based on what the Taliban were doing, adapting to them on the ground, and also adapting to NATO, because NATO originally let every provincial reconstruction team, every little spot of development that was being done by the outsiders, be uncoordinated. That each little provincial reconstruction team was being run by each country. So the Dutch had an Oresgon action plan, the Danes had a Helmand action plan, the British had a separate Helmand action plan, the Romanians were doing whatever they were doing in Zabul. Every country had their little spot, and they were not coordinated. As NATO was trying to develop a more coherent war effort, they met resistance by countries that were looking through the war through their own narrow straw. We saw Kandahar as being our spot of territory with our priorities. The military is like, but we need to coordinate this with a larger NATO effort. And so you had tensions where the military wanted to do what was right for NATO, and the civilians who were like, we have this checklist, and we cannot change the checklist because then people will accuse us of moving the goalposts. So they were not so flexible about this. So in the last couple of years, when we actually had a lot of Americans in Kandahar, and the Canadians became more focused in particular spots, General Vance, now Chief of Defense Staff Vance, had this program of improving this one village. And so we wanted to build schools there. And DFA and C were like, these schools are not on our maps. These don't count against the 50. So we actually didn't build 50 schools in Afghanistan, we built 52. But the two that Vance built don't count for the achieving success in Afghanistan. Now, one of the strangenesses of this thing is that if you ask most people in Canada, was Afghanistan a success, they would say no. They look up and see there's lots of violence today, more violence now than there was last year, more violence last year, the year before that. We're not sure the government can sustain itself. If you ask the Canadian military, they go, success story. You can tell that because every single officer who commanded in Afghanistan has been promoted except for, I want to say 2 or 3. Most famously, one who slept with multiple subordinates and who also had negligent discharge of his weapon. That is, he shot a gun when he wasn't supposed to. Turned out he did it when the Chief of Defense Staff was there, so it was kind of hard to.
He wasn't a witness.
He was a witness. He was actually the witness in the case, right? So he had a very checkered record. He got fired. So that meant that General Vance actually ended up doing two tours in Afghanistan because he did his tour, left this guy, General Menard replaced him, and then when Menard got sent home, Vance came back because he was one guy who was prepared to run the mission because the next guy in line wasn't ready to go for another 8 months or so. So almost everybody was promoted, so that suggests that things were good, that the military did its job. Usually don't promote people if there's failure. And so the military suggests a success story, and some ways of looking at the war, it was successful for the military because it helped to remind the Canadian people that they're warriors, they're not just peacekeepers. There's a mythology in Canada, there's actually many mythologies in Canada about this. One is that the Canadian Canadian military is just a bunch of peacekeepers. Another mythology is that there's a methodology that people believe this, on and on and on. But there has been, at times, frustration within the military about how they're perceived. When I was asked by the media in, I think, 2002, 2003, when Canada was going into Kandahar the first time, can these guys shoot? Can they fight? Because they've just been doing peacekeeping. It's like, actually preparing for war has been their day job. It's what they train to do, and then they add on to that the peacekeeping training. So, but there's a perception in Canada that we can't shoot. And this has sort of been repeated the past year or so by the new government, who has had a very confusing discussion about the new mission, about how much combat can we do, should we do. The military was able, through Kandahar, demonstrate that it can fight. And so that was pretty controversial. And in fact, when I get to the public opinion stuff, one of the questions about public opinion is not so, what, was the public opinion dropped because the Canadians were getting shot at, or because they were doing the shooting? Because for some Canadians, this was shocking. We are actually engaged in combat. It was actually asked yesterday by a Liberal MP. I saw just a brief coverage of the debate, but there was a Liberal MP saying, "Why are we doing? Can't we just do peacekeeping? Why are we doing peace enforcing?" Which is what he was seeing this mission as, which is like completely missing it. This is not peace enforcement or peacekeeping. What we're doing in Syria and Iraq, it's what we call war. Anyway, but the key challenge for the Canadian military was it was way too small for the task. That we put 1,300 troops into Kandahar in 2006. Ultimately, we got up to 2,800. Again, this is not unique. Every country sent as small of a force as possible into Afghanistan, optimistically hoping that that's all they needed. Every country then reinforced because they put in too small of a force, because it turns out there was more resistance there than they expected. Counterinsurgency traditionally has a math behind it. Now, the math isn't perfect, but the idea is you need roughly 20, for every 20 people, you need one counterinsurgent. The idea is you need to have enough counterinsurgents in the space so that way you know what's going on, so that we can identify strangers who are likely to be causing trouble, and be there as a resource for the people, so that way you provide some sort of order. We never got close to that number. Dennis Thompson, who was the general in Kandahar in 2008, came back, gave talks around the country, including McGill, where he did the math. He said, we're getting close, because he was including the Afghan police, and he was including the Afghan army, which was wildly optimistic in 2008. Army was mildly helpful, the Afghan army was mildly helpful at that point in time, the police, not at all. And so we never really got to those numbers until the American surge in 2008, 2009. And that's where you actually saw casualties drop. You saw a lot of effectiveness. You saw, if you saw the movie Hyena Road, which was came out last fall, it was a fictional portrait of the Canadian experience in Kandahar, and it was all about building a road, Hyena Road, to get from one end of Kandahar down to the other end. Because if you have a real asphalt road, then you can notice it makes it much harder to put landmines in there because you'll see the asphalt being disturbed. That was only possible once you had enough troops in the field. One of the controversies that's never really been examined is Canada did not send helicopters in 2006. It had to rely on having some out for the Americans and the British, which meant that the Canadians were much more reliant, really, on driving through Kandahar. And I think half or more than half of our casualties were in improvised explosive devices, which were essentially landmines in the roads of Kandahar. Had we been less reliant on the roads of Kandahar, we would have taken less of a hit. So we were too small, everybody was too small, but we held the fort. That is, Canada did not lose it. In fact, today, Kandahar still has not been lost. So to argue that all the work we did from 2006 to 2011 of creating some order, of training people, of training the military, has endured. Other parts of Afghanistan have at least temporarily fallen to the Taliban. For instance, Kunduz very famously last fall. But Kandahar has not fallen. And given that this was the traditional homeland of the Taliban, this is striking. So that might be an enduring impact. And Canada no longer had lots of restrictions. It used to be that when there were NATO exercises, the British would refer to Canadian battalions as can't bats. That Canada can't. Not that Canada can. Because Canada had lots of restrictions on what they could do. This is particularly the case in Bosnia. And so Rick Hillier, who grew up as an officer being restricted, have his hands tied, even when he was commanding the Canadian forces, actually all of NATO's forces in Afghanistan in 2004, when he wanted to use the Canadians, he'd have to ask the Canadian colonel for permission. The Canadian colonel would often say, "No, sir, I can't do that." And there's nothing the general hates more than having a colonel tell a general no. So he changed the rules. And so that meant when Canada went to Kandahar in 2005, 2006, they had many fewer restrictions than the rest of most NATO countries, which meant that they could go to Helmand to help out the British, they could go to Oerisgan to help out the Dutch, they didn't have to call home to get permission to do anything. Instead of being in a position of having to ask for permission, they could sort of say, okay, we're doing this, just to let you know, so you're not surprised, but we're doing this. So that came to a head, and when Vance wanted to focus on a particular part of some villages, to make an example out of them, to do real focused effort to try to build order and stability in one spot, which made a visible improvement, he had the authority of the military. Now the civilians were like, this is not part of our list. But the military said, yeah, you're the guy on the ground, you have the expertise, you make the call. But for the civilians, the biggest challenge from the military was its relentless optimism. That they would come back, the officers would come back. Things are going better, every officer would come back saying things are going better than before, things are going well, we're doing great things, and then there would be prison breaks, and there would be other things that would happen in Afghanistan, and that would cause the civilians to say, are this military lying to us? This war is not really going that well. And so there's a tension between the military being optimistic in order to promote morale, and the reality, and it creates a credibility gap. Can we believe the military when they're relentlessly optimistic about things? And so the military has to figure out how to communicate in ways where they're supportive of the mission, but they're also honest. When I was there in 2007 for a week in Kabul, Kandahar, we would go to the Canada House, or the recreation room. And in that arena, we'd hear from the Canadian military. We're not going to win. This is really not going very well. We're doing really well what we're doing, but we're building on sand. We're building on this Afghan government that has more interest in sending dollars to Dubai so that way they can cash out than in winning the war. But in public, rah, rah, rah. And so how do you bridge that divide? And that's something the military's got to figure out. All right, I'm going along, so let me just rush through the rest of this. One of the basic things is, you have been hearing is, the Canadian public is confused about Afghanistan. As if that's something wrong. Afghanistan's a confusing place. If you talk to experts about the dynamics on the ground, they often refer to it as shirts and skins, that one day you're playing for one team, and the next day when you meet together, you're playing for a different team. That the tribes will change sides at a moment's notice. So you'll see certain names come up again and again, like Dostum and Hekmatyar, who've been allies and adversaries of every single actor on the ground. Counterinsurgency is hard to measure success. That the NATO commanders would say, we have 63 measures of success, which means they have none. How do we know we're winning? And so, for the Canadian public to be confused about Afghanistan meant they actually had Afghanistan right. It's a confusing place. We're doing something there that's very confusing. We should not be certain about what's going on. The media were incredibly daring. The media lost one journalist, Michelle Lang. Graham Smith was willing to run around to meet up with the Taliban on his own. Now, the military is not a big fan because he was one of the guys who instigated the story about the detainee issue. But the bravery on the part of all these journalists who went on the roads of Kandahar, they were in vehicles that either got hit by IEDs or were in the next vehicle over. It was a very difficult time for them, and they met the challenge. At home, the media, their attention was kind of like a kid on sugar, in that they were very attentive to them, and then the mission, and then they weren't. If the mission was being discussed in Ottawa, they covered it. And if it wasn't being discussed in Ottawa by Parliament, by the Prime Minister, they didn't cover it. It was like night and day. The war was going on every day, but the attention from the TV stations and the newspapers, except for those key individuals who were embedded, was episodic. And they could have been asking some better. The journalists here could have been asking better questions about the mission, because they also fell for the distraction sauce of the detainee issue. In the course of the mission, it was mostly unpopular. The Blue Line was briefly popular. The big change, sea change, is in the fall of 2006, which is when things got serious in Kandahar. And one could argue that it was about us taking casualties, or you could argue it was about us killing people. And I wasn't studying this issue at the time, or else I would have tried to do some surveys to ask the Canadians, what is it about this mission that's upsetting you? Is it the bloodshed that we are having, or is it the bloodshed we are causing? A different way to look at it is to look at the red line is the casualties per year, the blue line is public opinion. And again, there's a strange relationship because casualties are going down, but the mission was also losing popularity. So any kind of math of doing correlation doesn't work. And indeed, in Canada, in the neighborhoods where Canadians, soldiers, lived, who then got killed, the popularity of the mission went up, not down. So there's no neat causal story about this. The only neat causal stories are that, while the mission was always more popular in Alberta, always less popular in Quebec, which goes towards various attitudes that Canada has across the country. They differ in terms of support for military force, support for NATO, support for these kinds of things. Another thing about this, this is also when you change in government. And one of the arguments about casualty aversion, about when you find the public being averse to casualties, is when the elites are not united. And one of the big things happens in 2006 is, well, before 2006, the Conservatives were out of power, and they said, yeah, well, we should be in Afghanistan. And the Liberals were in power and saying, yeah, we should be in Afghanistan. 2006-ish, 2007, the Conservatives are in power, supporting the mission. Liberals opposed. And so if you take a look at this line of 35 to 40%, what I need to do is find the line of support for the Liberal Party and Conservative Party and figure out how those, because generally I would think that this line really measures the popularity of the Conservatives more than anything else. Because people follow their parties. And the parties follow their people. I do think there's a talk today about government messaging that's happening at the exact same time as this. One of the biggest problems with Afghanistan was the Harper government had strict message management. That the talking points for the civilians in Kandahar were being written in Ottawa. So any journalist going down to study the efforts in Kandahar wouldn't, after having one moment with the civilians, were like, this is a waste of time. I'll get this when I'm in luxurious Ottawa. My time is scarce in Kandahar. I'll talk to people who actually tell me something I didn't know before I came here. I can't get from Ottawa. And so that meant that the journalists didn't cover the governance stuff, the development stuff. And some of that stuff was going well. As much as I've been critical of it, some of that stuff was going well, but that's where I never got home because it wasn't interesting. And it wasn't interesting not just because it wasn't violent, but it was also because you weren't getting anything that wasn't just over, committees having vetted the talking points to death. So the book ultimately asks who adapted well and who adapted poorly. The Prime Ministers adapted, but not in a way that was constructive for the war. They found ways to avoid responsibility. I think that hurt the Liberals. I think they became a less serious foreign policy party, although the Liberals had lots of problems in the middle of the aughts, so being able to point to their drop in popularity to this is hard to do. But Stephen Harper, very successful in ways that I don't think were very productive. The parties of Parliament, they only paid attention to what was the Teddy issue, which I don't think was productive. SIDA was, opposed to this entire mission because Afghanistan was never a priority, and short-term impact kind of development projects never what they wanted to do, so they resisted mightily the entire time. It was run, very centralized, run out of Ottawa, so they weren't adapting to events on the ground. I think the military did as a good job as they could do under the circumstances, given how they had too few people. But they adapted constantly to the new circumstances. I think the media did very well. And because I wanted the public to buy the book, I said they do well. Lastly, some lessons. Maybe I'm too naive about politics, but I think there's a pathway between selling out the mission to get elected and leading. I think that once you get in power, you have some responsibility, and there are ways to be responsible and to lead the mission. And we see this on other countries. The Danish prime ministers stood in front of the mission, and the popularity of the mission stayed higher for longer, even though the Danes paid a higher price per capita in terms of bloodshed than we did, than anybody did except for the Estonians. I think one of the biggest problems that the Harper government had was they refused to admit mistakes. And so people saw smoke and they thought there was fire. Well, it was just smoke. Afghanistan is a dusty place. Smoke and dust are confused with each other. You can make this is something new. We were doing something different. We can make mistakes and say, the line that the Harper government had was, we don't know that any of the detainees we've turned over have been beaten. The Afghans were beaten prisoners, but we don't have any proof that it's our prisoners. Please. Just say, we are doing the responsible thing. In fact, we were doing the responsible thing. When I was in Kandahar in 2007, we happened to visit a temporary containment facility, talk to the MP there, the military police person there, and she said, we're currently not turning anybody over because the Afghan unit we're working with, they're not being very responsible. Why did that news get back here? That's a good news story. That is, okay, they're screwed up. We're responding to that by not following the diktats that we're supposed to have turned everybody over within 96 hours. We're holding on to them because we don't want people to get abused. And once we see that they're behaving better, we're going to turn it on again and turn them over. But instead we had to say, our guys have, our detainees have not been beaten, at least not as far as we know. So everybody said, well, they're lying. And so that fed the detainee story further. I think for the whole government effort, rather than focusing on consistency with the original objectives, they should have focused on coherence. That is, how well are the bureaucracies working with each other? And how well are we working with everybody else in Afghanistan? Because guess what? It's not just about Kandahar. It's about this other 30 provinces of the country, this NATO effort. And if you can explain to the public, yes, we had these original goals, but guess what? This priority is no longer an issue. We realize it's not so much about water, but about electricity. So we're shifting our resources to electricity. Perhaps. I also think that one of the things that we need to figure out is, in these environments, the military learned how to delegate to the folks on the ground. DFAIT was learning how to do that. CEDA refused to do so. If you have 3 or 4 or 5 organizations involved with an operation, and some are delegated and some are not, there's no way you can have coherence, because one's going to be responding to the things on the ground, and one's going to be responding to the things in Ottawa, and the two shall never meet. And so as we train people to do their job, we should probably let them do their job, rather than micromanaging from Ottawa, as lovely as Ottawa is. So that's what I got. So I'm looking forward to your questions.